Well, welcome everybody. So my name is William Lindsay. I'm the Tansei, I'll say in my Cree tongue, the Director of the Office for Aboriginal Peoples at Simon Fraser University. And we just want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish peoples upon who shared this territory in traditional times. And we look forward to the opportunity to live and learn on their territory here tonight. So this lecture series is brought to you by UBC and SFU. Co-hosting, and we're also co-hosted by the Indigenous Research Institute here at SFU, and SFU Woodwards as well, supported by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement, so we want to give our thanks to those friends, and also supported by our office, the Office for Aboriginal Peoples. So tonight's lecture, good friends, and I should just maybe remind you there's 3 more in the series. This Thursday at Harbour Centre, room 1400, Daniel Heath Justice from UBC will be talking about, and Dr. Deanna Reeder from SFU will be talking about why Indigenous literature matters. So if you want to come and learn about Indigenous literature. Then on March 11th at SFU Harbour Centre, room 1500, Dr. Annie Ross from SFU will be talking about Aboriginal resistance and survivance. And then back here on March 18th, myself and Duncan McHugh from CBC's The National will be talking about Aboriginal myths and stereotypes. So a bit of a video presentation and discussion there. So without further ado, we want to introduce our special speaker tonight, Dr. Marianne Ignace from Simon Fraser University, Department of Linguistics and also First Nation Studies. And her presentation title is up here, I believe, First Nations Languages in the 21st Century, Collaborative Research with Haida Stories. So without further ado, we introduce you to Dr. Ignace.
Well, good evening, and thanks for coming out after a long day at work or or at school, wherever you've been. So I'm Marianne, and William has already introduced me that I'm a member of the Department of Linguistics, quite newly so. I was for more than 20 years a member of the Anthropology Department, and I've just recently, partly to do with the project and projects that I'm going to be talking about, made the switch to linguistics, and of course I'm also a member of the First Nation Studies Department. And I would like to begin this by paying tribute to my teachers, not those that are in universities or that were in my school education in different countries, but these are just, it's a collage of the elders from different First Nations that over the last, I think over 30 years now, have been my teachers. They have shared their precious knowledge of their language with me and helped to document and record their languages. And one thing that I'll tell you a little bit more about too is if you look at this picture here, which represents elders from different language groups. You have on the very left there one of my teachers from Haida Gwaii, Emma Matthews, and on top of that, Adam Bell, and we have below that Stephen Brown, and then various other elders. About 3/4 of the people that are in this picture are no longer with us. They've passed away, and that is kind of part of the situation that First Nations languages in BC, but across Canada and really across the whole world exist in. And I'll begin by talking a little bit about the issue of the kind of state of endangerment that Indigenous languages, Aboriginal First Nations languages, whatever we call them, in BC find themselves in. I'm sure most of you have seen the map that shows the kind of linguistic landscape that we have here in this, what is now a province, but of course the province is a very artificial boundary when it comes to languages. And depending on how you tally things up, BC is home to some 32 languages with 59 dialects, and we say some 32 languages, because the boundaries between what is a language and what is a dialect are a little bit flexible. And sometimes the political realities and boundaries kind of play a role in this as well. One example is that the Nisga'a language is considered a language unto its own nowadays, of course, with the Nisga'a nation behind that. If you ask Nisga'a elders nowadays, or in the past, to compare their language with the language of the bordering Gitxsan people, they say it's slightly different dialects, but we actually speak one language. But because of different political jurisdictions, they've become separated. And of course, there is also the kind of level of uncertainty as the number of speakers declines, and we have a single person perhaps representing a dialect or even a small language, then among those that don't speak that language anymore, excuse me, there are different kind of concepts and notions about where does a language end and where does a dialect start, and what are separate dialects than if people on a day-to-day basis communicate in that language. The figures here that I'm presenting, they come out of a 2010 report on the status of BC First Nations languages that was put together by the First Peoples Language, Culture and Heritage Council. We've got the web's address there. The council is a provincially mandated organization in British Columbia whose role it is to advocate First Nations languages and also to seek and allocate funding, as meager as it is, for the documentation, revitalization, teaching, learning of Aboriginal languages. And the 2010 report, I've been told, is going to be updated within the next few months, so keep an eye out for it. And the First Peoples Council, whenever they give out funding, which includes the federal funds, the Aboriginal Languages Initiative, or the BC Language Initiative, that provides anywhere from a few thousand to $20,000 to communities to carry out language revitalization projects. So when they do that, they ask the community to provide what they call a language assessment, to upload figures on how many speakers that community thinks they have, how many people in different age groups, how many people are currently learning the language, how many semi-speakers exist in the community, and so forth. So throughout this project, they've actually tallied some fairly good data, and pretty much as good as any, that reflect the kind of situation that languages find themselves in right now. One thing that stares at us out of the First Peoples report is that today, and this was 2010, only 5.1% of the BC First Nations population are fluent speakers of their language. And that's the average across the board. And how many there are ranges from basically 0% for some of the language groups in the Lower Mainland here to 10-15% or so. So there's a bit of variance. In addition to that, semi-speakers, who are basically defined as adults who understand their language but have never actively had to speak it as young children, and thus never actually were able to do that as adults, or who perhaps have partial knowledge of their language, so that you add another 8.2%. And of course, with that comes the reality that the vast majority of speakers are elderly. And one interesting and surprising fact, when I was looking at this report a couple of years ago first, was that First Nations language learners only make up about 11.1% of the First Nations population in British Columbia. So nearly 90% of First Nations people in BC is not learning their language, whether it's through school programs, through adult language education classes, and so forth. And the vast majority of that, nearly 90%, I'm quite convinced, if you look at the demographics, are especially younger people who live off reserves, who've migrated to the cities, and do not have access to their own First Nations language away from the communities of origin. And the 2011 Statistics Canada report actually reflects similar kind of data. If you look at the reasons for decline, they're well known in Aboriginal communities. Of course, residential schools that were compulsory between the 1920s and late 1960s literally beat the language out of 3 generations of children. When residential schools were shut down after 1969 and the supposed integration came into the BC school system, there was not one moment actually, turn the clock back 40-some years, when languages were still in much better shape and there were still young adult speakers of many languages to middle-aged speakers, there was not one thought in the BC school system to actually create bilingual education for First Nations children. And a similar to, or perhaps even immersion kind of education. It was just not on the map. And English is often considered the killer language. If you look at the situation in a community where you have, out of a population, in a sort of typical reserve community of 300 or so people, perhaps 2 or 3 people who speak the language, there's very little occasion in day-to-day life for adults to children to hear the language, or for those 2 or 3 people who might be separated by new housing subdivisions to even communicate with one another. And so I have seen this in my own home community, which is Skitchiston in the Secwepemc Nation in the interior. And when I moved there, or first was doing research there, in the mid-1980s, you could still talk to adults, elders, in the village square or so, and somebody would stop you and they'd start speaking in the language to you, and you would walk into their homes, people would have tea, and they would communicate using the language, very similar to the kind of situation that I experienced in Old Macedon, Haida 15 years earlier. And that situation doesn't exist anymore in my community. We're very fortunate. We still have about 10 elders who speak the language, and but there is almost no occasion anymore for people in the household spontaneously using it with one another. And that's very similar, in some ways even better than the situation as it exists in most communities. Most of you have probably read about or given some thought to what is lost when a language becomes extinct, and there's a body of literature about this from the field of language revitalization, and basically, of course, the cultural knowledge and wisdom that is embedded in a language ceases to exist, and ways of organizing thought also get replaced by ways of organizing thought in English. If you've studied linguistics, you've probably heard about what was called, or still is called, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which was developed by a student of Edward Sapir, a linguist, and who was a very interesting person, Benjamin Lee Whorf, in the 1930s. And Whorf stipulated that there was a close connection, and in fact a causative connection, between the way a language embeds and expresses and channels thought and the way then the culture exists in that context. So in that way, language influences cognition. For decades, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was kind of out the window as unprovable, but there have been some very interesting there's been interesting research in the last 15 years or so by various linguistic psychologists that have actually shown connections between cognition and language as it exists in particular languages, in particular around space organization and space. Language also includes a connection to environment in that it expresses traditional ecological knowledge, often knowledge that has been accumulated for thousands of years by people living for sustained periods of time in a known environment. And of course we know that language connects to identity, to one's history, ancestors, and to one's stories. In recent years there's also been some interesting research around how loss of language is related to health issues in the wider sense, making the connection between access to culture and language, learning, revitalization, and things like lower suicide rates in communities and so forth. And that's some of the work that has been done by Chandler and Hallett Lalonde. So that's just kind of in a nutshell. This table here is out of the same 2010 First Peoples report, and it's quite an important reminder that that we're at a critical time. The blue line, which the blue diagonal line, basically starting with the 5.1% of speakers in 2010, out of my earlier slide, moved steadily down. By now we're in 2014. So the number of fluent speakers of languages in the province, averaged out, sits at less than 2% now of Aboriginal people. And you can see where by 2015, 2016, it's basically going down to near zero. And so in other words, we're in a critical time because many of the Aboriginal languages in British Columbia in the next few years, or perhaps with a bit more time in the next decade, are going to lose all of their first speakers of their languages because of the age of the people that still speak these languages. And that's a very alarming and a very scary kind of situation. But if you look at the orange line, it shows that you can turn it around. Not all is necessarily lost, because one way to kind of stem the tide of language loss is to replace first language fluent speakers of languages with second language speakers who become as fluent as the first language speakers and then become the next torchbearers of the language, so to speak. And we have different kind of success stories. Take the Maori as one, often hailed as a success story in intensive work through language immersion. Hawaiian is in a similar situation. And of course, among all languages, Hebrew is often hailed like that, as being one language that has come back from the brink of extinction in a very different context, and of course around political and economic autonomy and sovereignty, which is something that First Nations in Canada are not necessarily in the situation of having. So, given those kind of things that through the work I've done for the last 20-some years with First Nations elders and communities, I was appointed in 2000, I think late 2011, to be the director of a new First Nations language center that SFU created. If you are on the Burnaby campus, you might ask, well, where is the First Nations Language Center? And I usually point to my laptop. That's the First Nations Language Center. I do have an office there, but for the most part, I'm in the field. And the center is really a network of people and opportunities. And you can go online and you can look at the mandate and the role of the center. But it's basically to provide research expertise with focus on First Nations language revitalization, to work with communities and facilitate communication between First Nations communities and SFU around the issue of First Nations language revitalization. So given that the university created a center, but with a very small budget to kind of just get things up and going a little bit, the next task was to find some funds to actually do that kind of research that we were hoping to do in partnership with communities, and which many of our partnership communities said this is urgent, as you've seen, because they're aware of the situation of their languages. So we wrote a proposal that was to get funds through a SSHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada partnership grant, which is a fairly new kind of funding category. And they, in a fairly long selection process, create opportunities around liaisons between community partners, academic co-investigators, collaborators, working around a common topic and theme to then provide up to $2.5 million in funding for those kind of initiatives. So we wrote a proposal, and it, in consultation with the, it started out with about 8 or 9 First Nations language grassroots partner groups and grew then eventually to 22. And around the priorities given the situation of their languages that everybody discussed and highlighted, we decided to build it around 4 pillars. The first task being to document First Nations languages while we still have elders and speakers that can be done with. And secondly, to support second language learners, because as you've seen from the table, within a few years, they may well be the only ones who know the language. So we all feel it's very, very important that in the quickest possible time, people of all ages can actually learn their First Nations languages as best as possible. And then we also received many requests and a lot of interest to build cool apps for people of all ages to learn their languages interactively in the absence of elders in the community or people that they could converse with as they were still practicing it. And another theme that came up also in our consultation with our partners was there were many instances where collections of language recordings or culture recordings that represent oral histories, that represent really the linguistic knowledge of the community, had become dispersed, lost, or people were fearing, gee, we have all these reel-to-reel tapes and they're now 50 years old and we can't find a machine anymore to play them, and they're getting moldy and whatnot. So it's important to create long-term digital storage systems for our data. And one person who made a very interesting remark in the slide, which really kind of made the lights go on in my head, was Kevin Borsario, who works with the SHIP, the Skidegate Haida Immersion Program in Haida. And he has been working with the elders there for nearly 20 years, recording the language. And he said, well, we do our work with high-tech equipment in a 40-year-old longhouse, which is a tinderbox. What if anything ever happens to the longhouse? So we keep a second set of everything in the Haida Gwaii Museum, which is couple miles away just down the road, and they keep it in safe cabinets and in good storage and all those kind of things. But we've just had 2 earthquakes and we've had tsunami warnings. What if we have a tsunami here and there's no backup? The legacy of our elders' knowledge of the language is gone. And so we're working actually with the SFU library then to create both protocols and then the actual technologies and the digital kind of storage systems that provide what is meaningful access for present and future people working on languages. So we have, as participants, 22 academic co-investigators and collaborators from a number of universities, of course including SFU, and I'm happy to see a couple of you here. Elton Yellowhorn, my colleague from First Nation Studies, is one of our co-investigators, as is Steve Wright from the Department of Psychology. And some of our co-investigators are linguists who have worked with communities on language documentation and revitalization, in some cases for decades. And some of them are First Nations linguists and educators. And some also hail from a variety of other fields that actually contribute to the kind of work we want to do through the grant. And we have approximately a dozen languages represented. Approximately is partly because what's a language and what's a dialect in some cases isn't fully clear, and also because some partners are still kind of congealing. But we have Secwepemctsín, the Shuswap language, Hatkil Haida, Somalia, Hailtsukla, Squamish, Skokomish, Downriver Halkamelum, Tlingit, Upper Shtlimkuch, and there are several languages in the Yukon represented. Chilcotin, Chilcotin is another one that we're working with. And we have 23 First Nations partner organizations. The majority of them are not large kind of umbrella organizations, but in most cases they're small grassroots organizations where language is actually happening, such as the Hatkilkusu Society in Masset, which is a local language society that brings a number of activists, learners, elders together. And we also have other, like in some cases, there are First Nations schools, such as Chief Atam School in Chase, which is one of the very few, if not the only, K to grade 7 school that provides an immersion program in a First Nations language. And we have, in some cases, they are, Taltan is yet another one that I didn't mean to leave out. We have the Taltan Nation Tribal Council and the 2 Taltan communities represented. So in some cases, they are fairly remote. In some cases, they are nearby urban, as some of the communities that represent Downriver, Halkamelum, Katzie First Nation and Tawasan First Nation, as well as the Queequetlam First Nation, just not too far from SFU. And at SFU we have the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies, which is actually the organization with which we are developing our cool apps. And because they received a large grant from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation about 7 years ago or so to develop leading cutting-edge apps for learning Greek as Greek language tutor. And so they have built an amazing capacity and technology and a platform to create interactive First Nations apps apps for language learning, which they've offered to the project as adaptable to languages. And the Bill Reid, it's not actually the gallery, it's the Bill Reid Center with its collection of archival photography for the coast that is also a partner. So that's the overriding project, our SSHRC partnership grant. And I am one of many co-investigators in this, although I also have the role of grant director. So part of the work that I do outside of actually working with elders in my home community, I get to work with the elders and speakers of Hutkil in Masset to do language documentation work. And Hutkil or Haidakil, depending on which dialect, is a linguistic isolate spoken in Haida-Gwaii. And it has 3 dialects, the Masset dialect, Skidegit, and Alaskan. Formerly, there were additional dialects, especially one in the far south, and those, by and large, are gone, although even if you take the speakers in one speech community, Masset, have actually a number of different, if you could call them micro-dialects, where there's just a slight variety in pronunciation or choice of words. There has been linguistic documentation carried out for Hutkil. John Swanton, who was an associate of Franz Boas, did some very important work early in the century, and I'll talk about him a little bit more in a minute. As did John Enrico, who is an American linguist who actually spent more than 20 years studying the language. And he published a monumental dictionary a few years ago, as well as 2 volumes of Haida syntax. And Bob Levine worked with the Skidegit elders in the, I think, mid-late 1970s. And more recently, Jordan Latchler, who is now at the University of Alberta, has worked particularly in Alaska with the last few speakers, and has become a real source of help and inspiration in documenting the language. And another one is Jeff Lear, who is at the University of Alaska. So we have now very few fluent speakers, and I've kind of, the numbers I've used here are somewhat arbitrary. I think Alaska basically says they have 2 speakers. The last very fluent speakers who lived in Heidelberg and Ketchikan, Irma Lawrence and Woody and Claude Morrison, passed away in the last few years. And they were, I think Claude he had just celebrated his 100th birthday. And Irma and Woody were in their late 90s. So they have one speaker who is in, I think he must be near 80. And the other one is Dolores Churchill, who's actually from Masset but lives in Ketchikan. So it can go down very quickly in a very short time. In Masset, we have 4 or 5. And in Skidegit, I've put 6 with a question mark because we also have a number of fairly fluent speakers, semi-speakers, and so forth. And as a language goes through that very tragic and terrible process of attrition, obviously those that were the previous generation of really fluent speakers who communicated in the language in everyday life, who spoke nothing but their Indigenous language when they were little, once they're gone, and it's their children's generation who had less of an experience in the language, but those are the only ones who are still there. So they kind of become the next generation of what is recognized as speakers. So that's the kind of situation in flux. But the fortunate thing is we have a number of eager young learners in Masset and in Skidegit. Back in 1900, John Swanton recorded about 100 texts from Masset Haida elders. And this was in the days before tape recorders, let alone reel-to-reels. You could not record epic stories on wax cylinders because they only held a few minutes, usually about the length of a song. So Swanton worked with several what were elders born in the 1830s, 40s or so, who were elaborate storytellers, and he would take dictation from them in the then kind of North American linguistic orthography that was in use. And subsequently then, Swanton would work over those texts with two bilingual Haidas, Mary Ridley and Henry Edenshaw, who were very fluent in English, but also were very fluent in their own language. And that way then arriving at a bilingual text, and this is how they're published in his 1908 Masset text. Column on the right is the Hatkil, the column on the left is the translation. And they're really of very good quality. I found when I first was working with Haida elders in the late 1970s during my doctoral research, that once I had familiarized myself with the phonology, the sound system of the language, and had a certain kind of level of knowing it, I could read them back to the elders I was working with, and they could, without much effort, understand them. So when I was doing my doctoral research way back, starting in 1979, 1980, and then throughout the next decade until 1987, one of my teachers was Sandalne, Emma Matthews. She was the widow of Chief Wea, Willie Matthews, who had been the hereditary chief of the village for 60 years. And she was raised speaking the language, obviously, and through her own exposure to her elders that had told her stories, through her husband, she was not only fluent in the language, but she actually was a very elaborate storyteller. And so I was privileged to be able to record some stories with her. My other teacher and elder was Adam Bell, Lana Stung. He was born in 1902 and passed away in 1987. And I've had the privilege to work with Lana Stung's son, Lawrence Bell, since the 1980s in Masset. And Adam was trained from a young age on as to become a chieftain, and in fact when he was probably 12 or 13 years old, in a ceremony of which I recorded the Haida narration, he took his hereditary title, Lana Stung, with the female matriarchs, elders, male chiefs of the village present and playing various roles, which he describes in his narrative. And it's an interesting kind of context, because if you take the time, born in 1902, so this ceremony would have happened in about 1914 to 15, 16, and that was the height of the anti-potlatch legislation, when the people in Masset around the profound importance of what it meant to pass on hereditary chiefships were doing this in defiance, and were finding ways to carry on these kind of potlatches to celebrate succession to chiefship. So some of the stories in the collection from Sandalne, Emma Matthews, and Lana Stung, we have it's quite an epic story of a man named Ishtini. And it's the story of a man who starts out at Kiusta on the very northwest of Haida Gwaii. And as he goes out fishing, he gets blown out on the ocean. And in the end, after probably what is 10 days or so at sea, alone in his canoe, he gets blown ashore in Tlingit country on the Stikine. And it has very interesting vocabulary about every which way that somebody can get blown about in the ocean by the different types of ocean currents, by being in a stationary pattern, by being by moving along, and which way with the wind and so forth. Another one, and the Ishtini story is one actually that's interesting because I recorded it with Emma Matthews, and it also existed in a recording from Swanton from about 80 years before. So they're interesting to compare. Among the stories that Adam Bell, Lana Stung, recorded with us is quite an epic set of stories. They begin in Tian village on the west coast of Haida Gwaii, and around a set of events that happened then involve the move of a clan to Yak, which is just around the bend on the northwest shore, and then people reestablishing a village at Yak, being helped by killer whales to raise their totem poles, and those killer whales then coming ashore while they have their potlatch, and they give them water as a sign of honor and respect, and the killer whales become their friends. And it's a very powerful story, especially the way Adam tells it. And those from Yak, then, in a subsequent event, 4 young men get blown out all the way to Hawaii. And it's quite a fascinating story that if you have read or heard about or experienced Polynesian navigation, where we know about sailing with the help of astronomy and ocean currents and swells and waves and bird migration and all that, you have parts and pieces of all that kind of knowledge, but in a Haida context, as it shows up in this story. And there's a clan story of Tulka village, which is across from Masset, and then a few stories that are really memories, reminiscences of things that happened in people's lives, like Lana Stung's succession to chiefship. So we began transcribing those actually in, I think, about the mid-1980s. It's a long time ago. And produced a rough translation of the body of what is sort of roughly about 20 stories of different lengths. And a few years ago, we actually resumed work on these to produce full bilingual transcriptions and also the linguistic analyses of the stories. So we have, except for about 3, I think we've got most of them done. Of course, the challenges of this are, Lawrence and I work together on this, and Lawrence is one of the, I think you're the youngest speaker, at least in Masset, and but he lives down here, so we have to figure out ways that we bring him up to Masset, we do the work down here, and so forth. And of course, a real good way to do this is also to be able to check things over with at least another speaker, and this is where Claude Jones, who's 93 now, has become our other champion who's going through this with us. Another major challenge is that the orthography of the language is, I would call it a work in progress, that's gone through various detours and caused by outside linguists in good part, and that can present incredible challenges to if people write different kind of ways, which way do you choose in the end? So it's being negotiated, and I think it's something where we're getting there. So what we've basically begun doing after we had produced a fairly decent transcription and then a typescript of a number of these is Lawrence and I have taken them back to Masset, and we have basically workshopped them with the group of the learners in the community, alongside with Claude Jones, who, this is Claude here in the picture, who, like I said, he's 93, and so he is able to contribute very, very valuable linguistic, like knowledge about the meaning of words, and also cultural contexts and of things that are said by people in stories. What do they mean? And one interesting way has been also through the workshopping to connect stories to song. In the Ishtini story about the man who gets blown out to the Stikine, after 4 days of being in a violent storm and getting blown about, he offers himself to the wind and sings a prayer song to the wind. And this was actually after we looked and kind of fixed up from the Swanton very crude lyrics, what the words of the lyrics of the song would be, one of our Haida language learners, Christian White, suddenly realized this is a song we've been singing for years, but we never thought it actually existed in or was connected to a story. So it's really for the dance group. It's provided an amazing kind of way to connect. Let me see if I can fire. So it gives you an idea. And so the really interesting and I think very useful thing was to actually figure out what the lyrics were. In addition to that, connecting real people to these stories. The Ishtini story from Swanton is about a Ishtini who was a hereditary chief, probably from the early 1800s, or possibly before that. It has no kind of European influences, implements, or anything like that. The Ishtini story that Emma Matthews knew is about that long ago Ishtini, but she was well aware of the then Ishtini, John Marks, who was her contemporary, who she did not directly learn the story from, but she learned it from one of his relatives. Oops. And so this is, it gives you just an idea right now of some of the way the stories look. And some of the interesting lessons we've learned from them is in the narration of the stories, they're all clan stories. So they're not made-up stories. They're what Haida called Gyashange, real stories. And they connect to real places, villages, places where something happened. And so we have, by way of people remembering those places, visiting those places, or sometimes Googling those places, we've been able to connect story to very specific locations. And also understanding more about the spiritual connection, particular to S'anwe, which are incorporated as killer whales, who are the souls of people who drowned at sea. And so Adam Bell's portrayal and the kind of connections he makes between humans and killer whales really add to that kind of knowledge that we have. And we have, as I mentioned, names, hereditary names that are in those stories that connect to current clan chiefs and name bearers. And one interesting thing has been around reconnecting stories to the land. In summer 2012, and in summer 2010, I was able to go with the group of the young kids from Chief Matthews School, which is the First Nations school in Masset, to the West Coast, Alanslang, which is a culture camp, and then actually being able to tell and retell the stories. And we took the stories on the land, so to speak, because in this picture here you can see those 4 young kids sitting on the very same beach where Adam Bell's killer whale beached themselves when the people were celebrating their potlatch there. So it's a very powerful kind of sensation. And also it really left an impression on the young kids to hear the story in that place that it came from. And they'll always think of that beach as the beach that connects to that story, and they'll remember it. And of course we have the power of language in stories. As I mentioned, the Ishtini story, but also the 4 people who get blown out to Hawaii experience every which way you can get blown about in a canoe through an amazing variety and quality of vocabulary. And there are many culturally embedded ways of speaking and the metaphors that are used in stories that we've got a better understanding of. The Tulka Ilnge, the Tulka village story, is a story about a man's younger brother. The man is a chief, and his younger brother is kind of, because he thinks he can get away with anything because his brother is a chief, he turns out to be bad and do bad things to people. And so he eventually gets killed by his own clansmates, and the older brother can't do anything about it. And it's really an expression of Haida law as to this is what happens when somebody gets out of line. And it has, as the young man is dead, and he is basically put up in the house of his older brother, and the older brother sings a dirge for him and then announces a funeral feast, but the way, or the feast for the wake, but the way he announces it is he tells the females in the household, and what he says is, hurry up, cook me a little something. Instead of saying, make a big feast now, he says it in just the opposite way. And in our research from Haida oratory, that is one of the features of oratorical speech, that you, by way of presenting what you're saying in the utmost humble or smallest way, you're actually doing the opposite. And there are very interesting metaphors in the language that express this. We have a story which is the story of Tohil Tau, who moves from one place down up Masset Inlet to out to the north coast, and being a mountain who leaves in disgust after his mother doesn't treat him equal. He moves around the island and leaves landmarks in every place he goes by way of rocks coming off him, and or making an inlet. And of course, Tau, being a mountain, would not walk on his feet. So the story expresses very interesting ways through Haida lexical prefixes and classifiers, how he actually bum shuffles around the island and different kind of movements. So those are just a few little snapshots of this. And the other thing, I mentioned the connection of story to place, but we also then, between 2000, I think it was around 2011, for about a year, we connected a Haida Place Names project to it, and where we recovered place names from previous recordings, from the elders that we were working with, and because they're all in their early 90s, they can't go out in boats anymore, so we could do very little of it by actual reconnaissance. But we did it all with Google Maps and Google Earth, and with a very technologically gifted cartographer who was able to take us virtually into inlets within, like, and places where we could see things within a few meters. So yeah, that's basically sort of just a snapshot of the kind of work. If you, one of the other projects that the community of Masset has been able to do with a couple of these stories is they've turned them into Haida Wood movies, and they're animated movies in like still motion photography. And the kids in the community and the language learners have all made the props for these, and then turned them into these little sort of 5-minute or so recordings. If you go onto the website of the Council of the Haida Nation, you can actually, or you can find them as YouTube movies, and they're interesting to watch. Okay, thank you. Got a few minutes for questions? Yeah, let's do 1, 2, 3. Well, we have, there's more than one way to organize things, right? But we have a large spreadsheet of the place names, let alone they're sort of indexed also in Word documents, where stories either from like Swanton or other recordings, or from some of the ones that we've done more recently are referenced. The dream, I like, because it's still a work in progress right now. I can't really show it other than sort of as this quick snapshot. But we're hoping, I think, within the next few months or so, it should be in shape. And especially around place names, we just for the northern part of Haida Gwaii, we recorded about 630 place names. And there's another set of over 1,000 for Skidegate, Indigenous place names. And if you, there's this really neat sensation if you, and they're on a Google Earth map. And then if you zoom in on the Google Earth map, you can see the place just coming alight with places that are named in Hatkill. And I was kind of thinking, gee, if we could do that with the entire Indigenous world, we'd have a very different kind of map, right? But yeah, so they're cross-referenced right now. Okay, Eldon?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make quickly a comment and then a question as well. It just strikes me that one of the more popular languages these days is in North America is Klingon. Which is a completely fictitious language, completely made up, and yet it's one that a lot of people are willing to invest in learning. Maybe they've got some tips that they can share with us to help us kind of make a hide on other languages. Pardon?
What's the language?
Klingon, from Star Trek.
Oh, sorry. I'm not media savvy.
But also, the question I wanted to ask is, what are the prospects for mass literacy? Because that seems to be a natural way to to try and record language through writing or having a literacy program. And I'm just wondering what are the challenges or what are opportunities with that?
Well, I think among North American Indigenous languages, practically and politically, there are vast challenges. One is, I don't want to overgeneralize, but we have scenarios where too many linguists have imposed orthographies on languages. And I mean, we have good examples too, where linguists have worked effectively together with communities and vice versa, and they have done it together. But Masset is one where for a period of 20-some years, the linguists kept changing the orthography on the people without consulting with them. So everybody writes, one person writes vintage 84, one writes vintage 92, and whatnot. And that becomes a huge distraction to actually deploying literacy in that way. But like I said, we've been kind of working towards like a usable, agreed upon orthography, because it has to be the learners and the people in the community that decide this is how I want to write. It can't be a linguist who tells them how you're supposed to write. And dialects tend to be a distraction too, in terms of like if you have 5 dialects in a given language, including even microdialects or something, then how can you have a unified orthography that is pronounced differently from place to place? For Greenlandic, they've done it, and I've sort of in language presentations I've given, I've often cited that. Hey, that's a really good example, because they set aside the dialects and they said in community A you're going to pronounce it this way, in community B you're going to pronounce it that way, or we're going to have one common orthography, and that just opened up the sky to mass literacy and Harry Potter in Greenland, in Inuktitut Greenlandic, and you name it, right? So, but I think communities are getting there, and that's the important thing. It needs to be the kind of thing that comes from within First Nations communities.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering about the written version of the Haida language. How long has that written form been around, and did that originate with the people in the community, or did that originate with non-Haida people?
Well, the first versions of alphabets, orthographies, came about in the 1870s, when Anglican missionaries first, like Reverend Collison, Keene, Harrison, they were the 3 basically who were the missionaries in the village, so in the first 15 years or so. Interestingly, each one developed a different orthography in competition with one another. But the elders can read that one. It's lethal for a learner because it doesn't use diacritics for glottalized sounds or for anything like that. But for an elder who knows a speaker of the language, they just insert the diacritics, right? So they're good. And then there's the Swanton orthography, which is really not used in the community nowadays. But we've had a lot of fun with the learners and elders kind of just trying it out, and so they can read the Swanton text, right? And then there have been the orthography that was developed, that's sort of the most probably widely practiced one, is what we call the Alaskan orthography, that was developed by a recently deceased lady, Irma Lawrence, from Alaska, and Jeff Lear, a linguist, and Michael Krause and a few others. They kind of had a set of workshops between fluent speakers and linguists, and hammered out an alphabet, which works to this day. And then we've had sort of another linguist who went through just different versions and vintages of orthographies that were ultimately rejected by the community. And so it's kind of a long way of figuring that. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for having me.